Good morning, dear students. In our previous lectures, we learned about the law of demand, which specifies that there is a inverse relationship between the price and the quantity demanded. If the price rises high, quantity demanded will come down. If price declines, quantity demanded will go up. That is, demand curve will either expand or contract, which we learnt in the previous lecture, and demand curve is not going to shift from its place. It will either expand or it will contract. That is a downward sloping demand curve. We also learnt about individual and market demand curve, but there was no shift in the demand curve because the law of demand specifies that there is relation between price and quantity demanded, keeping the other factors constant, and that is what we had learned previously. Today we will learn how the shift in demand curve takes place. Now you remember, just as we assumed that all the other factors are constant for law of demand, shift in demand curve will take place when we will keep all the other factors active, but price will be kept constant. That is, we are not going to change the price now. Other factors might change, and these factors will affect the demand. So now the demand curve will shift. Demand curve was drawn under the assumption that income remains constant, price of the substitute goods, price of complementary goods, preference of consumers, taste of consumer, habits of consumer, there are no changes. So this was the assumption when we learnt about expansion and contraction in demand, and we learnt about the demand curve on the basis of law of demand. But shift in demand curve will be opposite to it. Now we will keep the price factor constant and other factors will become active. Given the price of other commodities, that is, price is kept to be constant, and the preference of consumer's preference changes, maybe income increases, demand for the good at each price, and then there is a shift in the demand curve. For normal goods, remember, demand curve shifts rightward for the inferior good and demand curve shifts leftward. Given the consumer's income and the preferences, if the price of related good changes, that is, just see that one by one if the factor is going on changing. I'll repeat again. Price does not change, but what will happen if the income of a consumer changes? What will happen if the income of a consumer changes but price is not changing in that case? For example, apples were available for example 100 rupees per kg. They are still available at the same price, but the income of a consumer has shifted from for example 10,000 rupees to 20,000 rupees. So now in that case, even at the same price, the consumer will demand more at the same price. This will bring a shift in the demand curve. We will also learn it graphically. Let us see some other factors. Given the consumer income and her preferences, now we will assume that income is also constant, preference of a consumer, habit of a consumer is also constant, price is also constant. If the price of related good changes, that is, maybe substitute good or a complementary good changes, again there will be a change in the demand for the consumer at the same level of prices, and the shift in the demand curve will take place. That is, we are assuming the other factors constant but one factor active. It may be habit of a consumer remains active, maybe price of substitute good remains active, or price of complementary good remains active. So any factor remains active, keeping the other factors constant, including the price factor also constant. Demand curve keeps on shifting. On the other hand, if there is increase in the price of complementary good, demand curve will shift leftward. We will learn this graphically also. Demand curve can also shift due to change in taste and preference of the consumer. Now see, we are taking now the other factor, keeping the price constant, keeping the price of complementary good constant, keeping the income of a consumer constant. If the consumer's taste, consumer preference changes and he becomes more active to buy a particular brand which he was not buying previously. So so the demand may change again. If the consumer's preference changes in the favor of a good, demand curve for such good is going to shift. See, this is the slope of demand curve. It will shift rightward. Why it's going to shift rightward? Because price is constant, so there is no contraction and expansion in demand. But keeping the other factor active, that is change of taste and preferences of the consumer changes, demand curve will shift rightward. On the other hand, demand curve shifts downward, that is leftward, if there is an unfavorable change. For example, income remains the same, other factors remains constant. But now what is happening is the consumer sees that consumer is shifting his demand for some other product, and the demand for the particular brand for which he was in favor previously, now he is shifting his demand in favor of the other product. So your product, the previous product which the consumer was buying previously, that will be an unfavorable change in the preference of the consumer, and demand curve will shift leftward. For example, demand curve for ice creams is likely to move and shift rightward in summers. Price remains same during the winters also, during the summers also. Other factors also remain the constant. But now, as per the demand of the season, consumer is likely to demand more of the ice creams in the summer, because of the preference of ice cream goes high in summer, and the demand curve will shift rightward. Same demand curve will shift leftward during the winter season, because now the season doesn't demand for the ice cream by the consumer. So revealing the fact that cold drinks might be injurious to health and adversely affect the preference, this as the consumer awareness increases now. So even if they are likely to demand more of the cold drinks in summers, still because of the awareness of the consumer that cold drink is injurious to health, this will affect the demand of cold drinks leftward. So this is likely to shift the demand curve leftward, even if the price of price of the commodity remains same. So this is what I am explaining it to you. Keeping the price factor constant now, as against the law of demand, as against the expansion and contraction in demand, keeping the price factor constant, if the consumer's taste preference change, or the season change, or price of related good, that is complementary or supplementary good change, there is likely to bring a change in the demand curve, and this demand curve will either move rightward or it would move leftward, keeping the price factor constant. See, look at this diagram. Diagram A, we can see that price is moving. Price is not moving, price is remaining the same, but due to change in the other factors, demand curve, which is bolded, you can just see this bolded demand curve has shifted leftward due to the other factors. And in the second figure, that is B part, we can just see that this was the bold demand curve was the initial demand curve, but due to some other factors constant, not change in the price, due to some other factors which are changing now, the demand curve has shifted to rightward. Shift in the demand curve, A shifts the leftward and B curve shift rightward. Shift in the demand curve are depicted in this figure. I will be sending you the PDF of this also. It may be mentioned that demand curve takes place when there are change in some other factors and not the price of the commodity. Now we will be comparing the expansion and contraction in demand and shift in the demand curve. Remember, expansion and contraction in demand will not bring a change in the demand curve. Demand curve will only move upward or downward, but it is not going to change. On the other hand, when shift in the demand curve will take place, due to the other factors which become constant and not the price, then only demand curve will shift. See, the amount of good that the consumer chooses depends upon the price of a commodity, as I already explained it to you, that price of the consumer is very much price sensitive. But now when we learn about the shift in the demand curve, we will keep the price factor constant and we will keep the other factors active. Demand function in relation between the amount of a good and its price when other factor remains unchanged. So demand curve is the graphical representation, as I told you that there is an individual demand curve and market demand curve, but this demand curve is drawn on the basis of law of demand and inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. So demand curve is just expansion and contraction in demand. Shift in the demand curve will take place only due to the other factors which become active and not the price of a commodity. I will be sending the PDF of this also. Look at this first figure now. This figure explains the expansion and contraction in demand. When the price of a commodity, you can just see, when the price of a commodity is changing, it is affecting the demand curve. You can just wait, I'll explain it to you. You can just see in this figure. Okay, you can just see in this figure, demand curve is moving upwards due to rise in the prices, and the same demand curve will move downward if the price of a commodity, that is, if the price of a commodity increases, if the price of a commodity decreases, demand curve will shift downwards, that is, it will expand. Now look at this second figure. Expansion and contraction is not taking place here. You can just have a look at this figure number 2, that is B part. See, this curve is our initial demand curve, that is, price of a commodity declines and the demand expands. This is expansion and contraction in demand. Now let us assume that price doesn't change, it remains constant, but preference of a consumer changes in favor of some other product. So this will bring a change in the demand curve and the demand curve will shift rightward. On the other hand, if the consumer becomes unfavorable for a particular product, the same demand curve will shift to leftward. So this is how the change in the demand curve takes place. We will be learning it more in the class and we will be practicing more questions in the class. Till then, you please read the concept, understand the concept, learn the difference between the shift in the demand curve and the expansion and contraction in demand. So movement along the demand curve and shift in the demand curve, these two concepts we understood today. Revise the concept, I will send the PDF also, learn it thoroughly, and the assignment for the previous chapter for your practice, I will be sending it to you. Do complete those assignments by Monday. Thank you everybody.